Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stluke'sonline.org.
In collaboration with Boise State Public Radio, the Community Library presents a new podcast, Sheep Stories. I'm host Vance Cunningham. Join me as we listen through the archives of the Trailing of the Sheep Festival to learn about the Scottish, Basque, and Peruvian immigrants foundational to the sheep herding industry over the past century. Hear their stories of traveling to Idaho and learning the language of the sheep. Find Sheep Stories wherever you get your podcasts and at boisestatepublicradio.org.
More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Caudette. Across Idaho, nonprofits have been stretched thin by federal funding cuts, resulting for some in staff layoffs and the downsizing of programs. Now, despite having fewer resources, demand for essential services like housing, food, and mental health support has not gone away. All it's done is grown. However, nonprofits aren't the only ones feeling the pressure. So are the philanthropists working to support them. In fact, a new report from Idaho Partners for Good is highlighting this issue, prompting important conversations about how we fund the organizations that are doing critical work in our communities. So joining us to talk more about this report are Blossom Johnston, the CEO of Idaho Partners for Good, and Lance McGinnis Brown, research scholar with the Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State University. Welcome, both of you, to the show.
Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you.
Blossom, can you start by telling us a little bit more about this report and what inspired you to launch the Voices from the Field listening sessions?
You betcha. So we've worked with about 120 Idaho nonprofits in the last 5 years. And in January, when the federal cuts began to roll out and the ripple effects of that, we started hearing more and more from the field of those that we were serving about the chaos, the anxiety, the frustration, just basically the fallout. We then wrote a article about smart reform. There's always ways to cut waste, but we wanted to make sure that when were looking at how we do this thing called reducing government waste, that we're not hurting people unintentionally. So that's where this whole thing kind of began to emerge, that there was a need for someone to be looking at not just what was coming out of the nonprofit sector, but really where they were going for help, which was the philanthropic sector, since the government sector was reducing their investments. So we then went in to listen to 13 different leaders from foundations that fund in Idaho. They are not all located in Idaho, but they all fund in Idaho, from everything from your small local foundations like the Idaho Women's Charitable Foundation and the Brandt Foundation, to your larger players like the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation, your Inovia Foundation up out of Spokane, the Murdoch Foundation. So we tried to get a good cross-section so that we could understand really what is happening across the philanthropic sector that was funding in Idaho.
I'm wondering, Lance, if you might be able to answer this question. What kind of impact could these financial shortfalls have, according to what this report has come out with?
Right. A number of respondents expressed some level of concern about shortfalls and their potential impacts for two reasons. One being that nonprofits are facing decreased funding, which in turn could reduce their capacity to serve as many people, while at the same time, you're seeing other cuts to services as well, such as Medicaid and SNAP, which are likely to result in more people falling in need of nonprofit services. As a result, you end up with a crunch involving both reduced supply and increased demand, which makes for a challenging situation that could, as some respondents expressed, harm many vulnerable people who need that support.
And Blossom, is this a gap that philanthropy alone can fill?
Absolutely not. Just the federal cuts alone, which do not include reimbursements, grants to nonprofits that are just filed the 990 easy. So for $643 million were cut from the feds. And that was direct hits to 477 of some of our largest pillar nonprofits. These are the ones that are carrying a lot of the weight for the safety net in Idaho. So though that one thing alone, in the 11 foundations that we interviewed and listened to, they invest about 148 million. And not all of that is in Idaho because some of these foundations work outside of Idaho. So they would essentially have to give 4 to 6 times more than they are giving now in order to fill just that one gap. So the gap has spread even more. It's gotten bigger because of the exponential growth with our population, but then our growth in our ALICE population. So we've got more Idahoans in that ALICE, which is the asset limited, income constrained, employed, people who are actually employed. But we have seen a growth in that. And so the services are needed. And the front line of services is not our government, it is our nonprofit sector.
Lance, is there anything in particular that stood out to you during the conversations you had for this report, either from funders or nonprofit leaders?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that this is entirely shocking, but one thing that a lot of foundation leaders noted was that they're facing many of the same kinds of pressures that nonprofits are. Talking about limited capacity in terms of limited time, limited staffing, limited money, burnout, which is a perennial challenge in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, as well as, especially with these shortfalls, one respondent called it the tyranny of the urgent, the question of whether to focus on the pressing emergency or try to think more strategically in terms of long-term sustainable impact. It's very difficult to hold both of those two things in tension at the same time. What we find is that these pressures could also potentially create tensions between nonprofits trying to survive and foundations trying to show more return for their investment, even while at the same time we're seeing that both of these groups are facing many of the same challenges and are in the same boat. And that opens up a lot of opportunity for conversation and collaboration.
Can I just add
Blossom,
one more thing to that?
Yes, go ahead.
Can I just add on to that? Because I think we need to really understand that while there's a positive sentiment by the foundation leaders towards innovation and collaboration, we have to acknowledge that they have set up a very competitive environment. And so we've got to really start thinking about how we do nonprofits together versus individually, which is part of what the system is that's broken on the philanthropic side. So while they want collaboration, they've got to invest in that. Philanthropists have to invest in collaboration cross-sector.
I want to thank you both so much for coming in and talking about this and giving us a better understanding of it. We've been speaking with Blossom Johnston, the CEO of Idaho Partners for Good, and Lance McGinnis Brown. He is a research scholar with the Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State University. We've been discussing the changing landscape of giving in Idaho. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.